Hello, this is Johnny Chisholm. I want to show how we can go through an assessment and hopefully get into the ranking of a equip application. Um, right now in CD, I have the customer file open, I have the case file and the practice schedule open. At this time, the practice schedule consists of 4 cropland land units and 4 pasture land units. And if you look at the practices, the only practices that are scheduled on this practice schedule are it's actually prescribed grazing on the pasture field. So that's the only practices that have been scheduled. So the first step we're going to do is and you can either schedule the practices in Conservation Desktop or you can schedule practices in CART when we get into that part. So I've kind of chosen to do it this way. That'll show that the practices that I've scheduled in CD will be brought into CART, and then we'll add some practices in CART, and you'll kind of see how that works. So that's where we're at with that. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start the assessment. So I click on the Assess link in Conservation Desktop under the practice schedule. When CART opens, since there's no assessment for this practice schedule, it allows me to create a new one, and the assessment name is the practice schedule name by default, but you can change that. So we're going to click Create Assessment. It creates the assessment. It does some calculations here. This process will take a little while because it has to geospatially look up all the information from the land units that are in the practice schedule. So it'll take a few minutes to do that. So we'll hold on here for just a second. And as CART finally looks up all the information that we need geospatially, we can see that we have our list of tracts and land units that are contained in our practice schedule. We can expand those. You can see we have our cropland fields and our pasture fields. Now, in this case, since the client is actually only interested in doing some practices on the pasture field, we're going to unselect the cropland fields because it's not necessarily that we assess them at this time. We would also need to go ahead and add our modifiers. If your modifiers are not added in CD, we're going to click on the pasture. We're going to add a graze modifier to this pasture. So I'll repeat that process to add graze modifiers to all the pasture land units. And there we go, that's done. We've added the graze modifiers to all the pasture land units. So I'm going to save my changes. When I do that, it's going to take the cropland land units. They won't be included in the assessment, and it will save these PLU modifiers that I've made. So I click Save Changes. It'll also take a little time to recalculate the geospatial information, so you have to be a little patient to wait for that to finish. Okay, once it looks up the geospatial information again, you'll see that now our only selected land units are tract 2000, which are the pasture land units. So we're ready to get into the assessment part of it. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to identify the resource concerns that we need to assess. So I'm going to click on the resource concern list here. It brings up resource concern categories. You can see all those there, and it's a little bit unfamiliar to most planners. They're not categorized by like soil, water, air, plant, animal, etc., like we're used to seeing. These are actually in different categories. So it just takes a little experience in getting those in the right place. I do have a document that I've created from the assessment report tool that will show us the resource concerns that we would normally need to assess for pasture land. Okay, I'm going to open that document that I spoke about. Here we can see that this is kind of the recommended resource concerns for pasture to be assessed. And depending on the client's objectives, there may be others added, but typically these are the ones that you would want to assess for pasture land. So we see concentrated erosion category here, degraded plant condition here, field pesticide loss. So we're going to basically go through and select those resource concerns. So I'm going to expand the concentrated erosion one here. And of course, we decided that classic gully is one that we need to assess. I expand my land units and I'm going to assess that for all of the land units. Notice you can either select the individual land units or you can select the box by the tract and it would select all of those. So classic gully erosion has been marked to be assessed. I'm going to close that down. I'm going to go to degraded plant condition. We want to look at the plant productivity and health for all those land units and the plant structure and composition for all those land units. We'll close that one. We'll go to the field pesticide loss. We're going to do the pesticides transported to groundwater for all land units and the pesticides transported to surface water for all land units. Again, we'll close that one down, open this one up. We're going to look at the nutrients for those, for both groundwater and surface water, and also the sediment for those. So we've got those marked. They're not any on fire management. We don't need to assess any of those or inefficient energy use. However, since this is grazed, we're going to assess the livestock production limitation one. So we're going to select the feed and forage balance, inadequate livestock shelter, and inadequate livestock water on all the pasture land units. We also might want to look at the plant pest pressure for all the land units. The soil quality limitations, we're going to review the compaction, assess it for the pasture land units. And under weather resilience, we're going to use the natural available moisture. We're going to assess that for all pasture land units. And finally, we're going to assess the sheet and rill erosion for all those land units. So that's how you would select the list of resource concerns that need to be assessed for this land use. And if you'll notice down at the bottom, it gives a grid that shows the particular resource concerns that I have selected. And we can kind of go back and just check our sheet, and looks like probably we got most of those in there, how that was split out and how we can use this sheet and the cart tool to select the resource concerns that we need. So once we have all of our resource concerns selected, we're going to scroll back over and we're going to mark that these are done. You can either mark the individual ones that they're done here. Make sure all of those are selected. All of them are done, and we hit Save Resource Concerns. Once that's saved, we can go back up to the top and click on the Assessment Summary. And it shows that the resource concerns, we're going to expand our land units here. The resource concerns are complete for all of these land units that are in the assessment. The next step in the process is to complete the resource inventory. And CART is going to ask us questions based on the resource concerns that we've selected for assessment and the land use and modifiers that are selected. So at this point, you would need to have gone out to the field and looked at the land units out there and answered questions that were going to be asked of you in CART. And in order to help field users determine which questions are going to be answered, I've used the CART Assessment Questions Report tool to print out a list of the questions that would need to be answered for that land use. So we're going to take a look at that first. So here's an example of the completed worksheet for the client. Planner's name's on there. Plus, you should see a list of the questions that would be asked in CART. So this is something you can take to the field and document. For example, here under classic gully erosion condition, all land units, there was no active gully observed. If you look at the compaction question, tracts track 2000 fields 2, 3, and 4, the compaction was not significant. However, on track 2000 field 1, the compaction was significant. Livestock were present on all the fields. It was all the primary species was beef, cattle, cow-calf operation. As we go down through there, all fields had from 11 to 100 animals per field there. Also, livestock feed and forage imbalance. We see that there was an adequate forage supply, and producer desired production goals are being met on track 2000 fields 2, 3, and 4. However, there was inadequate forages on track 2000 field 1. Livestock shelter, all fields had adequate shelter for the livestock. And under livestock water, there was no livestock water factors met. So no quality, quantity, or distribution in any of the fields. So those would be marked. So this sheet's designed for the planner to take out to the field and document the conditions that they observed out there in the field. And this can be used to answer the questions as we get into CART for the resource inventory. So once we've answered all those resource inventory questions on our worksheet out in the field, we're ready to document our resource inventory in CART. So we're going to click on the resource inventory in CART. It's going to load up the surveys, basically the questions that are going to be displayed for the pasture land use and the resource concerns that we've selected. And when you look at these, there are several different categories in surveys. These are grouped by different groups here. We have a land use group, a management group, infrastructure, and wildlife. And notice the infrastructure and wildlife are complete. That generally means that there wasn't any questions that need to be answered for those particular groups. So we're going to start with the land use group. So I'm going to click on land use to expand it. And as we do that, it shows some different categories down here also. The first one is the inventory. So if I click on the inventory, there are several geospatially answered questions, and those are not required to be answered. They're already, if you look at them, and you expand that, they are already answered because they were answered geospatially. But one of them that is not geospatially answered is the classic gully erosion condition. So if we click on that, we'll see that this question is not answered for all the land units. But from our worksheet, we did not identify any active gully erosion on any of the land units. So I'm going to select no active gully erosion observed and answer that question for all those land units. The next one is the compaction. So if I expand it, we said that the compaction was not significant on some of the land units, but it was significant. And so I've marked it as not significant on these land units. And then I would put compaction is significant on that one land unit that we identified we had a problem with compaction. So if we go through those, any of these questions that are geospatial or they should be automatically answered, so you won't have to answer those. So I'm going to close those, and our inventory should be finished at this point. So I'm going to click on our livestock questions. And of course, the first question are livestock present on the POU. We're going to say yes. Livestock are present on all land units. Once you say yes to that, there are some questions that will pop up here that become active because we answered yes. This is a conditional question. If we answered no, then these questions would not need to be answered. But since we answered yes, we will have to answer those questions. So the primary species on that, we said those were cow-calf operation for all land units. We'll close that one back down. The animal numbers, we said there was 11 to 100 per land unit, so we will answer that one. So those are our animal number questions. And then we have our livestock feed and forage. We said that there were adequate livestock feed and forage on some of the fields, but there was inadequate forage supply on one of the fields. So we answer those questions that way. The livestock shelter, we said that the livestock have adequate shelter on all land units. We said that for the livestock water, that there was no livestock water factors. The quantity, quality, and distribution were all lacking on all the fields. So we answered those questions. The next set of questions that we'll need to answer are the grassland. It asks us for the pasture group. These were warm season for all the land units. The pasture condition score was fair for most of the land units. However, one of the fields was low, so we marked that answer. The pasture condition score, we can go through those and mark the answers to the questions that we came up with for our pasture condition score. Our pasture condition score for erosion was, we're going to say that those same, pretty much it was good on most of the fields, but that one field had a little bit of a concern. Soil compaction, we're just going to call that, let's see, it was good on some of the fields and fair on one of the fields. So you can see how you answer those questions based on the information that you gathered out in the field and how you select the different answers for different land units. So that should cover all of those. And sure enough, if we look, it shows that our livestock, our land use survey type is now complete because we've answered all those questions. The other one is our management. There is one group under that, and basically that it is the integrated pest management. And we're just going to say pesticides are used to manage pests, but he doesn't have a IPM plan for any of those land units. And under nutrient application, nutrients are applied to all the land units. We also need to look at the pesticide use and risk. And in this case, with the soils that we have and the pasture, we're going to go ahead and mark that the pesticide risk is low for all the fields. Once we do that, our survey type shows our questions are complete. When we're done answering those questions, we can mark that these land units are all complete, and we will save our answers. So all of that is saved. We go back to our assessment summary. And it shows that our resource inventory process is complete for all of those land units. In order to calculate the benchmark or existing conditions score for this assessment, we next need to enter the existing practices. So you just click on the existing practices. We're going to expand our land units. If there's any existing practices in one of these land units, and notice that with this land unit selected, it says it has no historical practices. If the land unit had some practices that have been previously applied that are in Conservation Desktop, say for instance they had a contract in the past and they apply practices on these fields, those that have been applied or contracted would actually show up here, but there's none show up here. Also, there's a place where the planner can actually go in and add observed practices that they have seen out there. In this case, we're just going to mark that there are no observed practices on any of these fields. So all we got to do that is hit mark complete for each one of the fields so that it shows as complete that the no existing practices have been documented out there. Once we do that, we can click Save. Close that and click back on the assessment summary. And now our existing practices are shown as complete. Since our resource concerns have been identified or for assessment and our resource inventory has been completed and our existing practices are completed, we can actually look at the results now because it should have show us the threshold and the existing condition points for each of these land units. So I'm just going to click on the results tab, and it'll show us under the plan roll-up, which is all land units. You can see here are the resource concerns that we identified. If the existing total has one of these caution signs, then that means that it does not meet the threshold. We see the thresholds here. In these cases, a lot of these cases, it's 50, but we see that in some cases that has been met, in some cases it's not. And you'll notice that if you point to it, it'll tell you which land units do not meet that threshold. You can also look at it individually by field. So if we look at land unit 5, we'll see that we have a compaction issue, a feed and forage balance issues, those sort of things for inadequate livestock water, natural available moisture use, but it shows that that those are concerns that have been identified for this field. Plant pest pressure is not a concern. Pesticides transported to ground surface water are not concerns, but you can see where the concerns are identified here. If, for example, one of these existing totals is not correct, the planner wants to override the existing total, then they can click on this button here and click override existing total, and they could document that in this case maybe it wasn't a concern, but generally that takes a little bit more time, and generally we don't need to do that. So from this we could start looking at some things that that would show what we need to do to address those resource concerns. So I'm going to go back to the assessment summary, and we'll look at our plan practices. And if we expand our track numbers, we'll see that our pasture practice, our pasture land units do have a planned practice. This practice was planned actually in Conservation Desktop, so it shows up here. We can go in and either mark this as primary or supporting. In this case, the prescribed grazing is a primary practice. Now, we also know that in this situation, we were having some trouble with livestock water. So I'm going to add a practice for to address that livestock water concern. In this case, I'm going to use a livestock pipeline. So I'm going to start typing in livestock. And you can see that there is a livestock pipeline. I'm going to select it. And there may also be might need a watering facility. So I'm going to choose the watering facility. Generally, when we put a watering facility in there, we're going to put a heavy use area around that watering facility. So I'm going to schedule those practices for that field. So then we have some other practices that have been added. These are draft status because they were added in CART. The one that's alternative it's alternative because it was added in Conservation Desktop. In this case, the livestock pipeline and the watering facility are primary practices. Actually, the heavy use area protection is a supporting practice because it is only supporting the watering facility to prevent problems in the future with that erosion around that watering facility. So once we're done with that, we can go ahead and hit mark this PLU complete, and we will save that. So once it's saved, and we would continue to do that for the rest of the plan units, but I'm just going to take a look at this assessment information again and go back to the results tab. We'll look at land unit 5, the one that we marked the practices that we're going to do on. So I'm going to click this not met on land unit 5. And notice now there is still a problem with compaction, even though the prescribed grazing gave us 20 points toward addressing that compaction problem. So even with the plan, there are still some resource concerns that are not met. Nutrients transported to ground and surface water. Uh, so we could actually go in and add some practices that might address that. To continue to um, bring these plan condition points up to the threshold. But that's okay. That's what the producer has agreed to do. We could recommend more practices, but in this case, he's agreed to do those practices, so we're going to use that assessment there. So we would continue that process. You can add practices, go back to the results, see how those practices affected the results until we're done with the individual land units. Just to show a little difference in the way these fields are calculated, if you remember correctly, the first field, field 5, had some. There were several questions when we did the assessment where we actually answered lower than what we did for the main fields. I've went back in and went ahead and put in livestock pipelines, watering facilities, and heavy use areas for all of these land units in the planned practices. So now all those land units are complete. So again, if we look at the results for field 5, we'll see that the existing total, this is the basically the benchmark condition, and then we see the practices that we included had some points, and then this is the plan total. This is kind of the after condition, and of course this is the threshold. So if you look at this field 5, it still did not meet the threshold even after the plan on the compaction, natural available moisture use due to drought susceptibility, and the nutrients were a problem, and also the plant productivity and health, and sediment transported to surface water. So we still had a little bit of concerns with those. Now, however, if we look at land unit 6, which did not have so many concerns to begin with at the beginning, the existing totals, the only problem was the inadequate livestock water quantity, quality, and distribution, and the nutrients, and the plant productivity and health. If you look at the plan total, planning those same practices on this field, the inadequate livestock water is now met. It does meet the threshold. The nutrients still do not meet, so it's still a resource concern even after the plan. And the sediment transported to surface water is still a concern after the plan. So we see that there are still some concerns. However, we have addressed some of the concerns that were there in the existing condition. So that's kind of how the system can be used, and you can look at the other land units as well. And they're probably going to be very similar to land unit 6. But of course, land unit 5 was the one that had some more concerns to begin with, and we have addressed some of those with our plan, but some of them are still not addressed. So you can see some of that. That's how you can review this type of information. So that's our assessment. We're pretty much done with our assessment, and if we're through with that, we can go ahead and change this to ready for ranking. So I'm going to click on the ready for ranking and update my assessment. It's going to recalculate all the points. Once the assessment is saved, we have changed the status to ready for ranking, and notice now that this assessment is locked. You can also look at the land units, and they have a lock displayed on them to show that there's can't be any changes to this. If you need to change it, you can actually change the status back with this drop down here to in assessment and make some changes. But currently, in order for this assessment to be used in a ranking, it has to be in the ready for ranking status. So we're pretty much good with that one. So I'm going to go ahead and close this window. We're through with the assessment. We'll go back to Conservation Desktop and look at those practices that we actually recorded in CART and how they're going to show up in Conservation Desktop. Okay, back in Conservation Desktop again, and we can see our fields actually are showing the prescribed grazing practices. If we look at the tables and go to the practice schedule table, you'll still see that the only practices that show up in the practice schedule table are the 528 prescribed grazing practices that we actually were in, or they were put in Conservation Desktop before we went into CART. However, if we go to the Create Edit Practices link in Desktop to look at those practices and add the practices, you'll see if we expand all, and I'm just going to minimize the land unit 1, but you'll see that the prescribed grazing is listed in there as the alternative. This practice was actually added in CD, and the practice footprint was digitized. It's actually a full field practice. But in this case, we have some other practices that show as draft practices. These practices were just added in CART. They are draft. They are not digitized. So the location of this livestock pipeline is not digitized. And the same thing with the heavy use area and the watering facility. And this is designed to be a time-saving feature, because if this application is not selected for funding, it is not necessary to go in and digitize those practices. So it saves time where the field office don't have to go in and digitize the practice prior to doing the ranking or prior to doing the selections for funding. But once a particular application is selected for funding, then any of these draft practices have to be attributed and digitized on the map. And if you look at one of these, it'll default to the 516 practice, but notice there is no location on the map. So we would have to actually digitize the location of this livestock pipeline in field 5 if this application is selected for funding. But if it's not selected for funding, we don't have to do that, and it's designed to save us time and not having to digitize practices that are not ever selected for funding. So that's the way it's going to show up in Conservation Desktop. Those draft practices are just the practice themselves, that they are not fully attributed and they are not digitized. If the application is selected for funding, these would have to be attributed and digitized. So that's the way it's going to show up in Conservation Desktop. Now that we've completed the assessment and we've marked it ready for ranking, we can actually go in and look at ranking the application. So we'll click on the Assess button, which opens CART again. Reloads the system and assessment information, and you'll see that this one is ready for ranking. It says it's locked. We can see that it's complete. If you click on the Actions button, you can see that there is a rank choice. So we'll click on the rank, and it actually brings up the list of ranking pools that are applicable to this application. And at the current time, there are only 3 ranking pools in Arkansas set up for EQIP applications. This general one, there's a pasture one, and there is a cropland one. Of course, since this application was all pasture and no cropland, it is not the cropland pool is not applicable to this application. So you can see that we have these two different ranking pools. It gives you a summary ranking score, but this is not the final ranking. I'm going to go in and look at this train AR equip pasture ranking pool. So I'm going to click on the three dots over here, and I'm going to answer the survey questions. When these ranking pools are built, this one has applicability questions and category questions, and they're automatically answered. But there may be some questions like program questions. So if I click on that, we see that there is a program question. Will this application address air quality resource concerns in a non-attainment area? And these type of questions can vary. I'm going to expand that and say no, that it does not do that. And I'm going to save my answers. So that is right now this ranking pool, that is the only program question that's in there. And then we also have a resource concern questions. So I'm going to click on the resource question. And does the application include any of the following practices to address soil quality limitations? So I can, again, this is just an example question, but if we didn't have any of these, then we could just hit save answers. And probably should have had a not applicable. I'm going to go ahead and mark cover crop so it'll show as saved. So, and that's just the way this ranking was built. So then once we're done, we can hit close this. We've saved our answers and we're going to close this. And then the ranking score is updated due to the answers of those questions. And we can do the same thing with the other ranking pool. Again, it's probably going to have the same questions just because these are just examples. So I'm saving the answers to that one. And the resource question, click on it, expand the question, and let's just say he's doing cover crops on that one. We save the answers. And then we can close that one. So then we see the ranking based on the answers to those other questions. So that's basically how the ranking will be completed. Again, these are kind of simplified questions that's built into the ranking pools. There'll probably be more complex and more variations on questions, but it at least gives you an idea of the process that you would go through to do your ranking.